Imagine the morning fog over Morehead, Kentucky on June 22nd, 1887. It doesn't carry the smell of wood smoke or damp earth. It carries the deafening roar of 100 rifles firing at once. This wasn't a simple duel. It was a full-scale battle, waged street by street, where neighbors hunted neighbors from behind windows and doorways. The history books call it the Rowan County War, often dismissing it as just another mountain feud. But was it? How does a quiet county seat turn into a slaughterhouse? And how does one man, a charismatic saloon owner, become its undisputed king, holding life and death in his hands? Today, we separate the smoke of legend from the fire of truth to understand how a political argument on a hot August day unleashed 3 years of terror. To understand the blood that was spilled, you first have to understand the land. This was Rowan County, Kentucky, in the years after the Civil War. A place carved out of the Appalachian mountains, where steep hills and deep, shadowed hollows kept communities isolated, suspicious of outsiders, and fiercely self-reliant. Here, the law wasn't something that came from the state capital in Frankfurt. It was something made by the men who held the most land, commanded the most respect, or carried the fastest gun. The forests provided a living, the cornfields provided the bread, and the family name provided your identity. It was a world that ran on its own clock and lived by its own unwritten rules. At the heart of this world were two powerful currents, pulling the county in opposite directions. On one side, you had the Martins and their allies. These were the Democrats, the old guard. They were farmers and landowners, men whose families had worked this soil for generations. They saw Rowan County as their birthright, a legacy to be protected. Their leader, John Martin, was a respected figure, the patriarch of a clan that embodied the traditional values of the mountains. They were the establishment, the deep roots of the county. On the other side stood Craig Tolliver and his followers. They were the Republicans, the ambitious newcomers who saw the future not just in farming, but in business, commerce, and control of the growing town of Morehead. Tolliver himself was a force of nature. He wasn't some backwoods brawler. He was a sharp, charismatic, and utterly ruthless man who ran the town's most prosperous saloons. He knew that real power didn't come from owning a few acres of land. It came from controlling the flow of money, whiskey, and votes. He was a political boss in the making, and his iron will was beginning to forge Morehead into his personal kingdom. This wasn't a simple family feud, not in the way the legends tell it. The names Martin and Tolliver became flags, banners under which people gathered based on their politics, their debts, their family ties, or simple fear. If you were a Democrat who felt the old ways were best, you stood with the Martins. If you were a Republican who saw opportunity in the changing times, you threw your lot in with Tolliver. Choosing a side wasn't just a political preference, it was a declaration of loyalty that could determine whether your family ate well or starved, whether you found justice in a courtroom or at the end of a rope. Life in Rowan County went on, with harvests and church socials, births and funerals. But underneath the surface, a bitter tension was simmering. It was the friction between the old world and the new, between the farmer and the businessman, the Democrat and the Republican. Every election, every business deal, every drunken argument was another ounce of pressure building in a sealed container. They were living in a powder keg, and they all knew it. All they were waiting for was the spark that would blow their world to pieces. The spark finally landed on election day, in the thick, muggy air of August 1884. You can almost feel it. The town of Morehead is buzzing, not with excitement, but with a raw, nervous energy. The air is heavy with the smell of sweat, cheap whiskey, and the metallic tang of unspoken threats. Men, their loyalties and their tempers stoked by liquor and politics, are gathered near the polling station, eyeing each other with suspicion. It was here that the first words were thrown like stones. The argument started between a Republican named Solomon Bradley and the Democratic patriarch John Martin. It was the same argument happening all over the county, a clash of the old world and the new. But then, a new player stepped into the circle, Floyd Tolliver, a relative of Craig's. The shouting quickly turned to shoving, and in the chaotic scuffle there was a flash of steel. In a single brutal motion, Floyd Tolliver's knife found its mark, and John Martin, the leader of the county's Democrats, fell bleeding into the dust. This was more than a murder. It was a public execution, a message sent in broad daylight. The Republicans had struck down the head of the Democratic snake. The Martin clan, stunned and enraged, demanded justice. They turned to the law, but in Rowan County, the law had a name, and that name was Craig Tolliver. He controlled the courts, he controlled the sheriff, he controlled the narrative. And so, it came as no surprise to anyone when a jury declared Floyd Tolliver had acted in self-defense and set him free. For the Martin clan, that verdict wasn't justice. It was a declaration of war. It was proof that the system was rotted through, and that the only law they could trust was the one they enforced themselves. They retreated into the hills, not in defeat, but to plan. A few cold months later, in December, Floyd Tolliver was walking down the main street of Morehead, wrapped in the arrogant confidence of a man who believed he was untouchable. He was wrong. A sudden volley of rifle fire erupted from a darkened alleyway. Floyd fell dead onto the frozen ground, his body riddled with the Martins' answer to the court's verdict. The blood of John Martin had been answered with the blood of Floyd Tolliver. A personal score had been settled, but a terrible line had been crossed. There was no going back now. The first drops had been spilled, and they had opened a wound that would bleed for 3 long years, turning the hollows and streets of Rowan County into a hunting ground. The war had begun. For 2 years, the war had been a story of back-alley ambushes and simmering fear. On June 22nd, 1887, it exploded into the open. Before the sun had fully risen, nearly 100 men from the Martin faction descended on Morehead. They moved not as a frantic mob, but as a determined army, entering the town from multiple directions with a single, unified purpose: to cut the head off the snake and end the reign of Craig Tolliver. The first shot wasn't a single crack, but a deafening, rolling thunderclap as dozens of rifles opened fire at once. For the townspeople huddled in their homes and cellars, the world dissolved into a terrifying storm of noise. They could hear the high-pitched whistle of bullets passing overhead, the splintering crash of lead tearing through wooden walls, and the sharp ring of ricochets off anything solid. The street outside was no longer a place for commerce or conversation. It had become a no-man's land. Through the shifting curtains of gunsmoke, a deadly ballet unfolded. Tolliver's men, barricaded inside saloons and hotels, turned second-story windows into sniper nests. The Martins and their allies returned fire from behind overturned carts and the corners of buildings, methodically advancing toward the center of town. Morehead had become a brutal chessboard where every move was a gamble with death, and the air was thick with the acrid smell of burnt black powder. This was a war of neighbors, and the cost was intimate. At some point during the hours of relentless battle, a sharp cry of grief cut through the roar of the guns from the Martin side. One of their own had fallen, John Martin's son. A leader in the fight had been forced to watch his own bloodline severed in the chaos, a father's worst nightmare realized in a hail of gunfire. The stakes, already impossibly high, had just become personal in the most painful way imaginable. And then, at the height of the battle, the central pillar of the conflict simply vanished. Craig Tolliver, the undisputed King of Morehead, had been directing his defense from a fortified position, a commanding presence against the storm. One moment, his voice was the anchor for his men. The next, there was only silence from his post. There was no heroic last stand, no dramatic duel, just a sudden, shocking absence. A single, unseen shot, fired by a Martin sharpshooter or a treacherous ally no one would ever know for sure, had found its mark. As the news rippled through the ranks, the fighting faltered. The organized defense collapsed into confusion. The gunfire sputtered out, replaced by an eerie, ringing silence. When the smoke finally began to clear, it revealed a town that had been brutalized. The walls of buildings were scarred with hundreds of dark marks, silent witnesses to the fury that had just passed. The battle was over. The king was dead. When the last echo of gunfire faded, a stunned silence fell over Morehead. It was the silence of a graveyard. Slowly, cautiously, doors creaked open. Townspeople emerged from their cellars and hiding places, not to a town celebrating a victory, but to a scene of utter devastation. The streets were littered with shattered glass, splintered wood, and the dark, still shapes of men who had been alive just hours before. The air, thick with the lingering scent of gunpowder, now carried the heavy weight of shock and grief. The war was over, but the town felt like it had died with it. For the Martin faction, their objective was complete. Craig Tolliver was dead. They hadn't stayed to claim Morehead as a prize. That was never the point. Their army of 100 men melted back into the hills and hollows from which they came, leaving the chaos behind them. They had rid the county of the man they saw as a tyrant, but in doing so, they had declared war not just on a rival faction, but on the state of Kentucky itself. They were no longer just feuding mountaineers, they were now fugitives. The Tolliver faction, once the iron fist that ruled the county, was shattered. With their leader gone, they were a body without a head. Panic and fear replaced the arrogant confidence they once held. Some of his most loyal men lay dead in the streets, while others, wounded or terrified of what was to come, fled the county, knowing that either the Martins' revenge or the state's justice would soon be coming for them. The empire Craig Tolliver had built with bullets and fear had crumbled into dust in a single morning. This time, the news of the slaughter didn't just prompt a temporary response from the governor, it demanded a permanent solution. The state of Kentucky had had enough. Soldiers of the state militia were dispatched to Rowan County, but they didn't come as peacekeepers to separate two bickering families. They arrived as an occupying force, with orders to disarm the populace and impose state law by force. Martial law, ineffective not in name, descended on Morehead. The era of clan rule was over, brought to an end by the cold steel of state-issued bayonets. With the militia securing the town, the gears of official justice began to grind. Warrants were issued for dozens of men from the Martin faction. Rewards were posted for their capture, turning neighbors against one another with the promise of gold. But the fear in Rowan County didn't disappear. It simply went quiet. People who had witnessed the battle locked their doors and their mouths, terrified of getting caught in the crossfire between the vengeful Martins and the newly empowered state authorities. The gun smoke had cleared, but a new suffocating fog of suspicion and fear had settled over the hills. The gavels that fell in the Rowan County courthouse weren't just calling a room to order. They were trying to hammer a new reality into place. The trials that followed the Morehead massacre were meant to be a display of state power, a clear message that the days of clan law were over. The courtroom itself was a theater of tension. It was the same building whose walls were still pockmarked with bullet holes from the battle. Armed militia guards stood at every entrance, their presence a constant reminder that this was not business as usual. The benches were packed with onlookers, family of the accused, Tolliver sympathizers, and curious strangers, all watching to see if the law of Kentucky was stronger than the code of the mountains. In the defendant's box sat the men of the Martin faction. But they didn't look like defeated criminals. You have to understand, in their own eyes, and in the eyes of many in the county, they weren't murderers. They were liberators. They had faced a tyrant that the law itself had failed to control. So they sat there, not with remorse, but with a quiet, stubborn dignity. They had done what they felt they had to do, and they were prepared to face the consequences, convinced of the righteousness of their cause. Their defiance was a silent challenge to the entire proceeding. The legal battle was as fierce as the gunfight that preceded it. Cunning lawyers for the defense didn't just argue points of law, They put Craig Tolliver's entire reign of terror on trial. They painted a picture of a county held hostage where the legal system was a corrupt tool in the hands of one man. They argued that the attack on Morehead wasn't an act of aggression, but an act of desperation, a people rising up to reclaim their own government. It was a powerful narrative that resonated deeply with a jury of their peers, men who had lived through those same dark years. And then came the verdicts. One by one, the men who had marched on Morehead and waged open war in its streets faced the judge. And one by one, the astonishing results came in. Some were convicted of lesser charges and given light sentences. Others were acquitted entirely. In the end, not a single man was executed for their role in the battle. The most prominent leaders of the Martin faction eventually received pardons from a sympathetic Democratic governor, effectively wiping their slates clean. The state had flexed its muscle, but the outcome felt less like a verdict and more like a negotiated truce. The old power structure was broken, and a new one, led by the Democrats, had taken its place. The men who had taken the law into their own hands had been vindicated, not by the mountains, but by the very system they had attacked. So, was this justice? The Tolliver faction was gone, their leader buried. The Martin faction, despite laying siege to a town, walked free. The law of men had been spoken in the courtroom, but the final judgment sounded an awful lot like the justice of the mountains. It left a profound and unsettling question hanging in the Appalachian air. Who really won the war? The war ended, but the peace was a fragile, bitter thing. The hatred stirred up by the feud didn't vanish with the last puff of gunsmoke. They seeped into the soil of Rowan County and poisoned the roots of the community for generations. For decades after the massacre, the names Martin and Tolliver were spoken with caution. They dictated who you did business with, whose children your children were allowed to marry, and which side of the aisle you stood on in local politics. The shooting had stopped, but the war lived on in quiet, resentful hearts. If you visit Morehead today, you might think the past has been completely erased. It's a bustling university town now, full of students who know more about textbooks than blood feuds. But the ghosts are still there, if you know where to look for them. For many years, the old courthouse stood as the most stubborn witness. Visitors could run their hands over the dozens of pockmarks scarring its brick walls, each one a physical memory of that terrible morning in 1887. And up in the cemetery, you can still find the grave of Craig Tolliver, the fallen king, a simple stone marker for a man who once held the county in an iron fist. But the most powerful reminders aren't the ones you can touch. They're in the landscape itself. The main street of Morehead is no longer a battlefield, but the ghosts of the men who fought and died there still linger in the local lore. The winding back roads and shadowed hollows leading out of town were once the sites of countless ambushes and secret meetings. They are quiet now, but it's a heavy kind of quiet, the kind that holds stories. Most people who walk those streets today have forgotten the names of Craig Tolliver and John Martin. The story of the Rowan County War has faded from living memory into the dry pages of history books. But the story hasn't truly vanished. It has simply become part of the place itself. It's a lesson embedded in the land, a reminder of how quickly order can break down and how thin the line is between neighbor and enemy. The people may forget the details, but the mountains always remember everything. So we return to the question that hung in the gunsmoke at the start of our story. How does a quiet county turn into a battlefield? The answer, buried for a century under the myth of a simple family squabble, is now clear. The Rowan County War was never just a feud. It was a political war, fought for the soul of a community. The names Martin and Tolliver were the banners, but the real conflict was over power, control, and whose vision of the future would prevail. Craig Tolliver became a king because he understood that in a place where the law was weak, the strongest will becomes the law. And the Martins went to war because they believed the only way to fight a broken system was to burn it to the ground. This story is more than a dark chapter in Kentucky's history. It is a brutal lesson in what happens when people lose faith in their institutions, when they believe the ballot box is broken and the judge's gavel is for sale. It shows that when official justice becomes a mockery, men will seek out their own, older and bloodier form of justice in the streets. This is a story not just of Appalachian violence, but of the indomitable and sometimes terrifying spirit of people who refuse to be ruled by a tyrant, even if it means becoming killers themselves. It is a grim reminder that the line between civilization and chaos is not a fortress wall, but a thin, fragile thread of trust. And when that thread is cut, the most ordinary of places can become a hell on earth. The men who fought and died in Morehead have long since turned to dust, but the lesson they left behind, written in blood and gunpowder, must never be forgotten.